for this very generous introduction. I have looked very much forward to this opportunity to share some thoughts and reflections and perhaps about even necessary turns and elaborations in psychology, in theoretical psychology. And it is indeed an honor for me to stand here in a forum for psychological research that still insists on the necessity of working with psychology as a discipline not exclusively rooted in the natural science tradition, but also as a theorizing endeavor grounded in the social sciences and the humanities. What I'll do today is to allow the implications of, in particular, new materialist thinking to inspire some reflections. And my theoretical points will mainly concentrate on the challenges that psychology encounters when studying the human and the social in times of ever more complex human and non-human entanglement and becoming. I'm going to argue that psychology needs to embrace complexity at multiple levels and within a comprehensive horizon of heterogeneously interacting elements and forces. I will, however, also argue that psychology needs to refine and elaborate a return from within the materialist perspective to the human as a research focus. At the end of this keynote, I'll talk a bit about the implications for ethics that all these considerations imply. I'm going to use a range of small, actually very small and limited empirical examples just to illustrate my points about the kind of ambitions I suggest we include in relation to psychology's further theorizing. So we will encounter different versions of technologically involved human relating and agency along the way. We do live in a period in history of science where knowledge production is compelled to address ever more heterogeneously composed patterns of human and non-human entanglement, both local and global in perspective, volatile across time and space, and enacted through the involvement of all sorts of technology. Of course, human lives have always been produced and enacted through intricate formative conditions of becoming, through, though the discourses, you could think at least, the discourses that were available and the life trajectories that were possible during some of the previous eras may have made it easier to engage with simpler and more reductive understandings such as linear causal explanations, purely descriptive and numerical accounts devoid of theoretical analysis, or other simpler versions of scientific knowing. However, heterogeneity, accelerated performance cultures, rapid social material changes, and volatile conditions for and processes of social and subjective becoming should have thrown into doubt straightforward ways of engaging with knowledge and not least with its production. To take an example, the formative processes entailed in digital participation among children and young people constantly open new horizons of potential identities, positionings, and body cultures that are comprehensive and complicated in different ways, in quite different ways than those accessible to previous generations. They were also complicated, but we have some new things going on. Contemporary teenagers and children access social media, they watch vlogs and interact with influencers. Some of them produce their own little YouTube videos and share their thoughts and their desires with large audiences, exposing themselves to evaluation by peers and by the anonymous crowd in the form of likes, by being ignored, imitated, ridiculed, admired, whatever. Their intimate relationships and friendships are performed in digital analog interaction involving sometimes hundreds of snaps, if it's via Snapchat, posted every day to prove authentic bonding. Navigation of the private and the public occurs through both direct and displaced negotiations, high speed, quick responses, easy to fall out, craving reactions, risking sudden contempt or invisibility. These young people and children encounter all sorts of reactions, many of them widely publicly distributed in response to their digital participation. While following all sorts of global digital platforms, they gather inspiration for their own relational practices and identity formation. They may experiment with positionings, with identities and belongings across cultural boundaries and learn a lot. And they also experiment across political, religious, and ethnic normativities, some of them. Or they may cling to particular belongings and thereby participate in the abjection of certain others, as we have seen in some of the 4 and 8chan communication practices that have recently been questioned again, following some of the recent shootings in US. So emotional, affective, social, gendered, and other kinds of input as to who they can be, who they can become, and how they may think, act, and relate, proliferate and produce still new forms of insecurity and security, new subject positionings, new invitations to belong, and new entanglements of potential ideals and trajectories to navigate. Now, psychological conceptualizations must be able to help us address the challenges also raised by such phenomena. They need to embrace complexity and heterogeneity at multiple levels. The conceptualizations, the theorizing, need to enable and assist empirical analysis addressing all sorts of elements and entanglements involved in such processes, which may include a lot of different dimensions. Subject formative forces entangling the material, technological, social, economic, the discursive, and many other sorts of potentially enacting forces, including what Karen Barad would term space-time mattering. Once we used to talk about context in trying to capture such a theorizing responsibility. However, even the concept of context has for a number of years been debated and considered too simplistic a perspective. Other disciplines have terms ready for us if we want to work with them. Foucault conceptualized the dispositif, Deleuze and Guattari, le assemblage, also used by actor network theory and science technology studies. Donna Haraway, Karen Barad talk about the apparatus, and in the Baradian version, the apparatus of interactive material discursive enactment. Philosophy, anthropology, sociology, more or less mixed with different versions of natural science, have already emphasized this heterogeneity in the enactment of phenomena, or as new materialists would call it, in the human and more than human worlding. However, I think that psychology needs to refine this awareness and attention much further. But in doing so, and in drawing upon new materialist perspectives, psychology also needs to elaborate a return from within the materialist perspective to the human as a focus. So this is not about avoiding the human or the subject, but as Judith Butler already years ago during the first period of post-structuralist feminism repeated on and on again, it's asking the formation, it's asking about the formation of the human and of the subject. And in this case, in its interactive social material, discursive, human and more than human becoming. It is the formative processes, conditions of becoming and potential transformation that needs to be elaborated within a much more comprehensive horizon, simply, of heterogeneously interacting elements and forces. Okay, now the contemporary managerial enthusiasm for measuring everything from performance in school and education to workplace productivity, these accelerating demands and the pace of capacity building across sectors in the neoliberal system of governance, parts of these tendencies somehow seem to be mirrored in much of the aforementioned social and digital interaction among not only children and young people, but also adults. I've already mentioned some aspects, but let me just give you another tiny example. In our study on sexualized digital practices among young people, and that's a study I'm conducting together with PhD student Pernille Rasmussen, who is here in the audience right here, In the study, but also in some of the studies that my master's students have conducted examining digital dating, we see quite interesting phenomena in terms of accelerated self-monitoring and evaluations of others. We already heard an excellent paper yesterday on Tinder, but I'm going to talk a bit more about Tinder. So, I guess you all know Tinder. According to the numbers, at least a third of you should have a profile on Tinder. But if you don't, it is a digital dating platform that allows you to swipe left to reject and right to accept based on a visual presentation, formed like what some people experience as a playing card, primarily comprised of a portrait with a few sentences perhaps attached containing a bit of information or a fun remark from the person in search of contact. When two people both swipe right, accepting each other based on their cards, there is a match and the possibility for contact opens. Users specify certain parameters, among them age, for instance, and maximum distance from their own location. This last option is meant to help facilitate the face-to-face encounter that may follow a successful match and subsequent online conversation. You don't have to invest much time and consideration in your choices. The swiping left and right can be done anywhere, whether on the toilet, we also saw that yesterday, even a picture of it, and some numbers on how many of the men are on the toilet while swiping. So you can do it there, or you can do it while waiting on the subway. And as Nadja Andersen revealed in her thesis, the purpose may shift. It may be a serious search for a partner performed alone in the teenager's room, or it may be used as a fun game and as means of bonding by a group of friends playing with the opportunities while adjusting the parameters for age or location and teasing each other or negotiating their preferences and normativity concerning romantic matches. Now, the design, the architecture of the site invites quick decisions based on brief visual representations. The high speed, the high pace interacts with gender discourses that, for some reason, continue to emphasize romance as a gender asymmetric staging. The man is to start the conversation. He is supposed to be taller and older. This is strictly heterosexual. There's a similar one for homosexuals and homosexual people, and also for others. But this is heterosexual. And this asymmetric system is then, in our part of the world, paradoxically combined with ideals of gender equality. I'm not going to talk much about it, but some very interesting things come out of this that you wouldn't expect. Anyway, these elements, in turn, entangle with a youth culture that hails an ironic and satirical, often boundary-pushing and provocative form of humor. So all this entangling messiness enacts a somewhat tough atmosphere, actually, apparently offering fellow human beings as objects to each other to be consumed or rejected at the market. It's a fairly instrumentalizing and some would say cynical invitation that's built into this piece of technology. And users talk about Tinder game, they talk about Tinder, or some of them experience Tinder as a gamification of human relationships. Nevertheless, people navigate such environments in different ways. We cannot generalize here. Some use it as a source of casual sex, enjoyed by both partners. Some encounter abuse, violence, and rape. Some find their soulmate, get married, and have children, facilitated by this digital meeting place. As Butler teaches us, conditions of becoming are merely enabling constraints. So no doubt, and this is my theoretical point, the main point, no doubt the digital design, that is the material and technologically enacting forces involved, are strong in their interaction, but they are not the exclusive determining factors. No doubt the discursive forces and implied normativities, with their disciplining and subject formative effects, the asymmetrical yet often paradoxical gendering, and the youth cultural forces, no doubt all that all these things are strong in their intra-agency, but neither they are exclusively determining factors in these particular practices. And no doubt the biological bodies, the desires and embodied self-experiences, no doubt the effects of historically specific social and subject formative processes are very strong interacting forces. But what they are and what they do is situated in their interaction with the digital design, with the economic interests saturating that design, the biographically and historically premised subjectivities, and a sociality that's always already agential as these new subject formations and identity positionings are being formed, challenged, practiced, and moved. If psychologists, researchers are to understand such kinds of practices and their social and subjective effects, we need assistance from theories capable of capturing and conceptualizing variations and diversity in terms of all of this and entangling trajectories or of intertwined effects and dilemmas, contradictions and volatile becoming. We need theoretical and analytical frameworks, thinking technologies, sensitive to heterogeneity, processual and entangled social material discursive, whatever words you want to use, enactments. Now, in thinking about theory, about refining and developing theoretical frameworks sensitive to heterogeneous processes of being and becoming, I would argue that we may learn from Donna Haraway and Karen Barat's introduction of diffraction as a concept for bringing together not only phenomena and forces in our analysis, but also different kinds of theories, and as Barat puts it, reading such theories through each other. There was also a paper yesterday that addressed that issue, a very good paper. Bringing theories together, try to think theories in dialogue. I've already used the term interaction a few times. Interaction and diffraction are, as you probably know, closely linked. Barat prefers the term intra-action to interaction because she wants to emphasize that the forces, the elements and phenomena encountering in the apparatuses permeate and transform each other as well as the new phenomena they, in that very transformative movement, enact together. And she talks apparatus, but you can think dispositif or assemblage or whichever term you prefer to assist your conceptualizations. In her case, it's apparatus. It is a sort of, hyperdynamic, you might call it, take on the processes of becoming that Barat is engaged in theorizing. And obviously, any hyperdynamic take needs a conceptual grip on the also congealing and stagnating elements of such processes. So Barat uses the term agential cut. Agential cuts, you cut things together apart, she says. And the congealing of practices, this last term is borrowed directly from Judith Butler, to also capture such aspects. Anyway, intra-action is here brought in to focus the dynamism and transformative character of the enactment of phenomena. And now diffraction. In Barat's agential realist version of new materialism, the term diffraction is brought in from the field of physics, which is where she has her educational background. Diffraction refers, in its classical definition, to the way in which waves, sound, light, water waves combine and move. How they intermingle, move into and through each other, re-emerge from within, how they keep moving, dissolving, re-emerging in still new forms and changing. These movements imply differences and boundaries as generated from within, and that is where you have the agential cuts, the boundary-making, efforts to define, demarcate, etc., etc. Now that kind of movement and enacting concept forms actually the very model of Barat's thinking. So she takes a physical phenomenon and uses a conceptualization of it, first of all, as a model for her knowledge claims about the enactment of phenomena, but second, as a principle, I would say metaphor, but that's contested. That's something people debate a lot. Of course it's a metaphor, sorry to say, for the kind of conceptual development that she produces by reading different theoretical frameworks through each other like waves. So I'll let these concepts assist me in making my next theoretical point, which is, if we are to qualify our analysis of interacting forces in attempts to understand the enactment of complex and heterogeneously produced phenomena, we need different ways of knowing, and we need already elaborated knowledge about the specific elements and forces, as far as they have been cut agentially from each other, in entangling in the apparatus or the dispositif or assemblage, whatever. However, we need that knowledge not as a truth claim about a demarcated and out-of-context phenomenon, but as a qualified suggestion about the phenomenon. I repeat it, as a suggestion that will be useful to bring along when we start analyzing the phenomenon in its interaction and enacting entanglement with other phenomena and forces in the apparatus that produces whatever constitutes our research focus. So let me, at this point in my argument, do a bit of reparative work on my sometimes perhaps slightly skeptic, even sometimes bordering condescending way of talking about positivist psychology. I sometimes used to insinuate that such an approach is reductionistic, that it risks generating inaccurate knowledge because of its reductions and because of its belief in simple causalities and its monolithic character. Now, psychology, let me make that quite clear, psychology rooted in the natural science tradition actually does contribute very valuable knowledge if that knowledge is situated as one among many contributions to a diffractive reading and a diffractive study of the more comprehensive apparatuses that produce the phenomena we want to understand. And again, we can use different kinds of subject, different kinds of concepts here. We don't need to use Barat's conceptualizations. Some people find them, well, estranging and weird, even ugly, I've heard. So I'm quite okay with whatever brings the point across, that we need a theoretical perspective that helps us think in terms of heterogeneously, highly dynamic and comprehensive assemblages, apparatuses, dispositifs, as enacting the phenomena we need to understand. And this is very important, that it's practice, it's a society, it's us as researchers that partake in performing and enacting the agential cuts which form the focused phenomena. So in relation to positivist psychology, my argument here is more of a critique of the scientific hierarchy that places positivism, so-called strong evidence, natural science-based psychology on top, dominating, and as the kind of approach whose results get closest to something called the truth about our phenomena. It is more of a critique of such a positioning of this particular research approach than it's a clear-cut rejection of it. The scientific hierarchy, in that sense, should look different, simply, or it should be dissolved, perhaps, or it should be at least transformed. It would be much more helpful, much more productive, if the theoretical or meta-theoretically informed complexity analytical ambitions in whichever conceptual wording you might prefer, if that formed the foundation for our academic thinking and the specific approaches, the results, the studies, etc., were considered and brought in as contributions to our diffractive reading and our diffractive analysis. So I think diffraction is an interesting term if we are to transform the hierarchy of science. Now, I cannot illustrate this point by introducing, well, positivist or phenomenological or psychoanalytic or cognitivist bits of knowledge and theory and reading them diffractively through each other within new materialist framework, since I'm not an expert in any of those traditions. But I can illustrate the point by taking just a few steps towards discussing post-structuralist and agential realist conceptualizations in relation to each other, and in doing so also underlining my point about a return to the human worlding within and through the more than human, the technological material worlding. I'm going to try to illustrate my point here by focusing on a tiny micro moment drawn from one of my analysis of violent gaming practices among children, which was a study I did as part of our bullying research that Lina mentioned already in the introduction. My point here is that I couldn't have done that microanalysis of this micro moment using either post-structuralism or agential realism alone. Both were needed. And I am quite sure that the analysis might have been improved by introducing and diffractively reading additional theoretical resources to perhaps actually phenomenology and perhaps actually bits of the newer versions of psychoanalysis. Who knows? So first, a bit of theoretical discussion. When I started working with technologically mediated gaming among children and young people 10 years ago, perhaps even longer, far back, I had already worked with post-structuralist theory and analysis for years. However, in spite of Michel Foucault's conceptualizations of the dispositive and Judith Butler's bodies that matter, and the work of other truly groundbreaking and inspiring scholars within that tradition, I found myself in need of an approach more focused on the material and technologically entangled enactment of different phenomena. If I hadn't been doing this technology focus, I don't think anything could have pushed me in that direction, but this did. Bringing in Dan Eide and Peter Paul Verbeek's post-phenomenological conceptualizations of material and technological intentionality was also helpful, but insufficient. And actor network theory somehow failed to satisfy the need too, because, at least in its early versions, it cultivated the material turn to such an extent that it seemed to suffocate any theoretically refined approach to the formation of subjectivity. Although agential realism is similarly unable to provide a refined conceptualization of subject formation, as a framework, it seemed more open to a rethinking of such processes and of the social conditioning of gender intersecting with other social categories across analog and digital agency. So working with colleagues, I therefore focused on developing reconceptualizations of post-structuralist concepts such as subjectification, objection, positioning, etc., with materialization read diffractively into the theoretical takes and thereby assuming a more central role in our analysis. However, at that time, I kept, and I still keep, finding myself turning to Butler and the tradition she represents for inspiration when faced with more complicated and intricate processes of subject formation and enactment of social patterns, of social conditioning and negotiations of normativity in my ethnographic material. Barat is quite clear. I'm sorry about all the words here, but I had to cut a bit down here, so I can't explain all of it. I just say that Barat is quite clear in her critique of Butler for not going far enough in her theorizing on matter and for mainly conducting her analysis of materialization as a congealing of practice in relation to the intricate conditioning of sex gender. That's not enough for Barat. However, I have increasingly come to agree with Sarah Ahmed, who years ago warned us not to turn matter into a fetish object. Ahmed accused Barat and new materialism of caricaturing post-structuralism as matophobic. She cited Barat's use of a range of matter discourse is not sentences. So she quoted Barat saying, matter is not little bits of nature, matter is not immutable or passive, matter is not an individually articulated or static entity. Discursive practices are not anthropomorphic placeholders for the projected agency of individual subjects, culture, or language. Ahmed wondered if anybody ever made such claims, and if so, who? So Ahmed actually questioned the very foundation of the material turn in this version, pointing to earlier feminist work on biology and gender that did in fact emphasize the entanglement and the traffic between nature, biology, culture, and between materiality and signification. And she quoted Donna Haraway saying, well, I'm not interested in policing the boundaries between nature and culture. Quite the opposite. I'm edified by the traffic. And so Ahmed argued that by turning matter into an object or theoretical category in the Spiragian sense, way, she says, the new materialism reintroduces the binarism between materiality and culture that much work in science studies have actually helped to challenge. So don't turn matter into a fetish object. Now, we all know that the core ambition of agential realism or new materialism is to keep the entanglement between matter and discourse, between materialization and culture, the non-human, the human, analytically vital. Nevertheless, I think Sarah Ahmed has a point. And that point, surprise, sits beautifully with my point about a return to the human, but within a new materialist conceptual framework. So let me illustrate why this is important. And here comes the micro moment of an empirical example to illustrate my point. In my study of video gaming, a group of 10 to 12-year-olds allowed me to watch them play Counter-Strike. This is a so-called first-person shooter game in which the gamers play from a first-person perspective. They can control a set of weapons and eliminate enemies during armed conflict in various locations. The young people play against each other online with both strangers or with people they know, and this is a game that can be performed as a single player and as well as among teams. And if you didn't already know, the professional Danish Counter-Strike team Astralis has actually won several worldwide Champions League tournaments, as well as the Intel Grand Slam, and made a fortune on their professional gaming. So it's a very well-known and very popular game among many, not only Danish children and young people, and has been for years. Anyway, on this particular day, Mick, Daniel, Sarah, and Ryan are playing Counter-Strike, surrounded by a number of spectators. The pedagogue has left the room, so the children have turned up the volume on their machines, and they shout at each other and at their avatars as the game moves on. Mick shouts angrily, "Daniel, dude!" and punches Daniel's analog body the moment after his avatar has been shot by Daniel's avatar. The atmosphere is quite tense. "Yeah, I whacked him," Ryan shouts out in triumph, having killed Sarah's avatar. Sarah says, "It was a her." An avatar soldier has been killed and falls forward, blood splashing everywhere, and everybody cheers. Getting no response, Sarah shouts again, louder this time, "It was a her." And this time it works. Her avatar spawns, but is shot shortly after, and Ryan shouts, "I whacked her," and cheers loudly. Sarah says, with barely hidden contempt, "Yeah, it wasn't that hard to say, was it?" Indicating her satisfaction with the correction of gendered naming. Now, a lot of things are at stake in this small excerpt, but one aspect has to do with the gendering of violence. Is it possible to acknowledge killing, fighting, and doing soldier as girl agency? Or does a girl doing these things have to be addressed as a male, if in any way possible? Where are the agential cuts to be enacted? This is about normativity, entangling technology, analog digital embodiment and play, humor, identities, and much more. When I started working on this small excerpt and other observations from my research material, I needed more than new materialism. I didn't even go that far in elaborating on the subject formative aspects of these kids. I needed more than new materialist and agential realist conceptualizations to understand processes of negotiation, the subjectification, the variations of agency and agential interpretations enabled social and embodied bonding, all that sort of things. However, I also needed more than post-structuralist perspectives to be able to analyze such movements in their material discursive infiltration. Negotiating agential cards via this game appears highly entangled by the digital material design. Although masked, all avatars are designed as male. Their heavily armed bodies, the movements, are designed to hail masculinity of the kind familiar from the American war movies, also from other movies, but no, American. And for the boys playing, there was a taken for granted continuity. There was an absence of agential cuts between analog bodies and digital gender, violence, killing, and the material discursive enactments of culturally intelligible masculinity in a particular version. Sarah, however, calls that coherence, that embodied taken for granted, into question. She insists gendered coherence between analog and digital bodies, no matter the virtual material design, and she insists coherence among female and violence, killing and fighting. Similar to the taken for granted coherence linking male and violence, killing and fighting when the gamer is a boy. So she wants to move the agential cuts, usually enacted and lived by the other gamers, supported by the digital materialization offered in the game, and thereby to twist the agency of this materiality in its entanglement with culture, with discourse, with normativity. And she succeeds, at least during this game. The boys accept referring to her virtual male avatar as a woman. I whacked her. Although they probably at first didn't see why she'd refuse the offer of a more dignified and superior positioning as a male fighter. And although they stumbled a bit at her insistence, as it forced them to question the otherwise automatic asymmetry between male and female fighting in that game, but they accept. They don't want to lose her. She's a good gamer. Now, obviously, or I'm not sure that Sarah knows that what she's doing is to move agential cuts. I'm sure she's not. And also, a much richer analysis could obviously be performed, but just these first few steps, attempting to work out an understanding of what is going on, show the necessity of continuous refinement and diffractively elaborated retunings of our analytical concepts, here done by reading the two different frameworks diffractively together. It is important, I just have to repeat, it is important to introduce the materializations offered to Sarah, both analog and digital, to the analysis and to be aware of the embodying effects they perform. However, if we do not pay sufficiently refined analytical attention to culture, to discourse, to imaginaries, affects, and all their enacting power entangling with materializations of social patterns, social and subjective agency. You could continue. If you don't do that and qualify analysis along such lines, we risk losing a lot of important insight. And we also risk losing interest in important kinds of research material too. You can just think about Elisabeth St-Pierre and her dream data, all those kinds of very interesting data. Now, these particular kids playing with digital violence, they already maneuver the digital analog high-speed interactions in ways that work well within their friendships, producing a lot of fun and action, while also touching upon and working with some of the troubling aspects of life that they're trying to get a grip on, namely violence. However, there's another area that's somewhat problematic for a lot of young people, and which obviously invites theorizing capable of informing analysis of highly complex phenomena and their enactment. And this is an area that also highlights some of the ethical issues that need thorough elaboration as part of a potential transformation of the scientific hierarchy, particularly when dealing with psychology. So I've reached sort of my final part, the one about ethics. Now, I don't have time to go probably explore the subject, but I'll suggest just a direction of my argument. In this previously mentioned project that I do together with Pernille Rasmussen, looking at young people and their digital practices, we also look at some of the more problematic practices which involve the sharing of sexualized digital visual material without consent. This is an issue that enacts a lot of pain and struggle and shame for those exposed, and a mix of excitement, bonding, guilt, and danger also among those sharing and trading the material. Now, this is an area that invites strong reactions from adults, and as researchers, we are invited to take sides, to engage in determining who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, and many of you will recognize that situation if you work within conflicted areas. Now, my focus here is not on the empirical findings of our research. That will be another day, another talk. Here, I mainly draw on the study because it provides a strong case in terms of illustrating, but also challenging my final point, that being that the accelerated social enactments effected in the intra-agency among technology discourse and market rationales, all of this interacting with sexual and otherwise interlinked anger and troubled becoming among some teenagers. All of that and much more also places or merely a different or merely extended form of ethical demands on us as researchers. We are used to think ethics in terms of the well-being and integrity of individuals involved in our research, securing anonymity, you know, the whole guidelines, securing anonymity, consent to participate in interviews and observations, blah, blah, blah. But the ethics that we may consider to embrace now, and as a consequence of also of what I said about new theoretical ambitions, that ethics also need to address the apparatuses that produce the human and the subjects as phenomena. In our study, this more extended perspective on ethics is interlinked with our methodology too. In doing cyberethnography, we do not necessarily know who, how many, or where people are. The trading of images and videos moves very fast in and out of emerging and closing websites, and Pernille is an absolute expert in tracing and finding such material and sites. Repositories of sexualized visual material open and close depending on conditions around the web. The material in itself changes character and meaning across web context. So the same picture may mean something here, the beach with the family, but over here in the context of all the nudes, it means something different. Now, looking at this traffic, we don't know if the names of digital traders or of those who comment and review such material correspond with persons bearing those names in analog life, or we know they don't. In the closed and sometimes very extensive websites, it's difficult to ask every member for their consent when we enter the site and follow varying forms of activity, etc., etc. So this individualistic, this focus on the individual and consent and integrity is also complicated by the material in itself. Now, we have had a very interesting reaction from certain academics to such research conditions, telling us, well, don't do research in that field if you cannot live up to mainstream ethical principles, which I think, sorry to say, is an utterly ridiculous thing to say. Digital interaction is a part of contemporary and future human lives, and as psychologists, researchers, we cannot choose to turn the blind eye to it because of insufficiently elaborated ethical principles that are incompatible with new kinds of environments and life conditions. We have to do something, we have to elaborate them. Therefore, my suggestion is that researchers join together in a retuning of ethical reflections, this being relevant not only to our field of research, but more broadly to other areas of empirical psychological research too. We need, I think, a de-individualization of ethics, as well as of conceptualizations of the versions of care and empathy that some psychologists use to produce knowledge about the phenomena in their research fields. We need a reconceptualization of ethical considerations within the more comprehensive perspective of material discursive intra-agency to understand, for instance, destructive and dysfunctional phenomena and to interact with them in transformative ways, if that is the ambition, which it often is, and it definitely is for us. We need to embrace the apparatus that produces such phenomena and work on its vitalization and response-ability. This is a strange word, but it's also from New Materialist thinking, and it draws attention to the conditions and the practices that enable objects and organisms, here humans, to respond. Barat links response-ability, responsibility, and mattering in her conceptualization of ethics. Anyway, we need to embrace the apparatus that produces the phenomena in focus and work on the vitalization and response-ability of its interacting forces and elements. And to do so because material discursive intra-agency entails processes in which elements, forces, and phenomena not only encounter but also transform each other in that very encounter. To try to demarcate certain parts of the apparatus from intra-agency, to freeze, fixate, control them, cut them away, close down their response-ability, will hamper this intra-transformative process. So although perhaps a bit provocative, even repulsive, I'd say, ethics need to deal with all parts of the apparatus, including the bad guys, and including those parts that produce the evil, the suffering, the dysfunctional, or with whichever destructive phenomena we as psychologists, researchers study. And in acting ethically, we need to do so with care and empathy, also embracing such parts in order to understand, not accept, but understand their intra-agential effects and to enhance their transformative intra-agential involvement and responding. And this is where the attention and obligation to individual well-being may be reintroduced as part of the comprehensive ethical perspective and ambition. As psychologists, researchers, we have to stay with the trouble, as Dana Haraway advised us years back, while doing our research within such conflicted apparatuses, even though the immediate urge might be to demarcate and label the trouble and call for action to confront and control it. That's what happens in Denmark right now. We have the umbrella case, if you have heard about it. More than 1,000 young people being prosecuted in such cases. Now, staying with the trouble, encouraging its intra-transformative involvement would be one of our small contributions as researchers to a vitalization of intra-agency in some of our disciplines' limited apparatuses, which nevertheless link into and interact with the more comprehensive apparatuses of the Anthropocene and even the Cthulhucene, as Haraway terms our current era, where we have to deal with the mess produced in the Anthropocene and learn and repair. So those were the words for today, and thank you for your patience and listening.